Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. And thank you to all of you, to Timmy, to yourself, Faith, to Laura, to all of you for inviting me to speak. And I very much enjoyed listening to the presentations. And thank you very much to Mr. Sherif. And I hope the ambassador can join us in due course. I must start with a disclaimer, which is that I'm not an economist per se, but I'll just try and put a few takeaways which I got from his excellent presentation. The first thing I would say is, just in a general sort of context, I very much enjoyed listening to the presentation because to me it was, as you say, it was content heavy, and to me it speaks really to what we are now coming to in the 21st century, which I think is we've moved from what we had decades ago when I was young, which was Afro-pessimism in the developed world. It kind of took Africa as a very troubled continent. Pendulum then swung across to, I think, a kind of extreme form of Afro-optimism. But today, I think what we've heard from Mr. Sherif is African realism, in which he's balanced the optimism with the challenges that Africa is facing. And I think it speaks very much to the AU's Vision 2063, because that also includes vision of hope and prosperity for all, but it does also talk about the challenges and what needs to be done. So I think Mr. Sherif's presentation is very much in sync with it. His mention of what I call the poverty growth conundrum, I think is very much in sync with that as well. So I think it is very, very important. He raised that fundamental question: how can the continent, which is potentially the richest in terms of resources, also be, for many of its citizens, the poorest as well? And I think that is the fundamental question which we have to take forward. How can this be? And I think a lot of the way forward is to, as he has said, to talk about inclusive. I think the part of the formula to move forward is that we have to have inclusive growth across Africa. We have kind of the elites moving forward. What we have to have is a cascade effect, I think, rather than, as he said, the trickle-down effect of growth and wealth creation in Africa is not really working. So what I think we have to have is what I would call a cascade effect, which broadens the wealth creation and makes it inclusive for all. So I very much second what he says on that. In terms of aid dependency, again, this speaks to the African Union 2063 agenda, which is the move away from aid dependency. And I think actually COVID is pushing this narrative along, because just for instance, in terms of the UK, just a few weeks ago, we heard the UK, for instance, is cutting its foreign aid budget from 0.7% to 0.5% of GDP, and other countries may follow suit. The global north has been hit by, global north is also in entering recession. So in actual fact, Africa has to move, like it or not. As Africa, we have to move away from aid to trade. And part of that is by developing our own internal resources from the integrated African market, which is coming on stream next year, and by making sure that growth is equitable. But I really like that he touched on reality of the poverty situation for 110 or more, for probably a majority of Africa's citizens. And that is very, very important. Uneven development, I think, is what he's referring to. And that is, it's slightly disappointing that after all these decades and so on and so forth of African growth, we still have uneven development. But I think the positive message is that as Africans, we acknowledge it and we want to take it on board, but we have to have equitable development, which encourages entrepreneurship and so on and so forth. And I think also that is a positive. What I think perhaps we also need to think about, which perhaps he alluded to, but perhaps didn't speak that much about, is the informal sector in Africa. How do we better integrate the informal with the formal, and possibly also with the diaspora? I think going forward, that is something, I'm sure that's something which the ADB also is looking into. But I think the better integration of the informal, because Africa's economy is largely informal. So how do we, in terms, I would say, of recovery, I think pushing forward the informal sector, which includes a lot of entrepreneurs as well, and SMEs, I think has to be a part of growth. So I think that is very, very important, particularly what he says, as I say, about foreign aid dependence. We have to move away. We have to turn the pendulum on that, from where a number of countries, a lot of their budget is dependent on foreign aid. I think we have to make foreign aid as far as possible to reduce our dependency on that. One thing I would maybe ask people to think about just going forward, possibly including the development bank, is how do we turn, obviously COVID has raised the issue of health in Africa. Is there a way that we can turn health into a driver of economic recovery and aid, purely beyond the humanitarian? Obviously the humanitarian is very important, but I just wonder if investing in health as well as in other areas is a way that perhaps we can also help to drive recovery and development in Africa. It's just a thought going forward, so that we can perhaps look at investing in health, not just in terms of the humanitarian and having people, but a kind of hub and spoke effect to help also drive recovery in health. So I think I've very much enjoyed his presentation. I also took on board what he said about power generation and electrification in Africa. I think that is absolutely crucial. We cannot have sustainable development without sustainable power. I think that is, and also that also impacts, of course, on African technology. And African technology, or Afrotech, as I call it, is going to be one of the drivers of African growth and recovery, and that requires electrification and power. So again, I think investing in that is very, very important. I know time is against us, so I'll just say just one more thing about the ADB, which I think is, as Africa, I think we really appreciate the work which the ADB is doing. They are, in many ways, what's called Africa's preferred partners for both for governments and also for the African citizenry. And their tailored approach to countries, the recognition that Africa is not a country but a diverse continent, I think that is very, very important. And that is the way going forward. We need Africanization of development. And perhaps I'll speak a bit more on that when I make my presentation tomorrow. But I think the ADB is really leading in terms of the Africanization of African development theory and practice, and African economic growth and practice. And that, I think, is a key driver going for that Africanization and ownership of the African economic growth agenda. I think I will leave it there in the interest of time, but thank you very much.
A lot has been said, and I just want, in a very short and brief manner, for you to give your parting shots here before we close the session.
I remain an optimist on Africa, but I would say I'm an African realist as well. I think what has been said is really speaking truth to power in many ways, because some of this will also depend on political will. I mean, I think that's perhaps not been discussed in this conversation, but a lot of the things will depend on political will. I have a couple of doubts with regards to, I take up Khalid's point on the formalization of the informal sector, but I must admit I have a few doubts on that. I think we were liable to face resistance, but I think I take his point that I think it has to be a negotiated discussion between formal and informal sector going forward. But as I said, and as John has said, bringing in the informal sector into this discussion, I think is actually essential to recovery. The informal sector, I think, in many ways, is the heart of the recovery, and then the other issues in terms of growth going forward. So I think the informal sector must be part of the heart of our discussion. There are many other things I could say, but that point in particularly, I would push on. Thank you.